I appreciate this being held today. I appreciate the remarks that I've been able to hear thus far. I appreciate the work that the Corps of Engineers has done to work with us on getting post-authorization change reports and placeholders, working with the Office of Management on budget on everything from southern reservoirs south of Lake Okeechobee for storing of water to the repair of the dike around Lake Okeechobee. These are things that matter a great deal to my community. I don't know if there's anything that matters more to my community than these issues. The Kissimmee River restoration, the raising of the Tamiami Trail, all of these projects that flow between one another, it matters. It matters to have them executed in the appropriate order, to have the appropriations made to them. So I appreciate everybody's work and their advocacy for this issue. Now in that, I've heard a lot of comments about risk management, about up to the shoulders, about everything going on with the management of the water coming out of Lake Okeechobee. That's what I'm going to speak about very briefly. And that is the issue that is at the crux of what goes on in my community. This is not just an issue of risk management. If it were simply an issue of risk management that was being dealt with by the South Florida Water Management District and the Corps of Engineers, that would be something that would be palatable to my community. Because in the aim of flood control, we can understand that water has to be sent into different places of Florida. Even if it's a place in Florida that plays no role in contributing those waters to Lake Okeechobee, the Treasure Coast of Florida, or contributing to those algae blooms, we could understand that to some degree when you're talking about the lives of 36,000 people south of Lake Okeechobee. What, however, we are additionally talking about is all the water that sits on Lake Okeechobee for those entities that have a straw in Lake Okeechobee because they need to suck the water out of it for one purpose or another. Whether it's for irrigating agriculture, whether it's for providing drinking water, whether it's for sending water into a God-made river because it needs it. There are other entities that need water, and they don't always get the water that they need even when they're asking for it. I did recently sit with the South Florida Water Management District, and I asked this very pointed question, which goes to the management of risk. I asked, what is the optimum level of water on Lake Okeechobee? And the answers were given, well, in the dry season, we don't want to see the water dip below 14.5 feet. And in the wet season, we don't want to see the water above roughly 12 feet. That was the answer that was given to me. And I asked, at what point, if the water dropped below that level, if the water on Lake Okeechobee dropped to 11 feet or 10 feet or 9 feet or 8 feet, at what point would all of the other entities that are pulling water out of Lake Okeechobee cease to get the water that they need, whether it's for irrigation or drinking water or other things? And the answer was not 10 feet. The answer was not 9 feet. I got down to the point of 8 feet, and the answer was no, they would still get their water. They'd still get the water that they get through things like consumptive use permits. So if all of this is about managing risk, but we're keeping the lake at an artificially high state during the dry season because we want to make sure that all those other entities that have a straw in the lake still have their water, but we acknowledge that we're still going to send them their water even if the lake is down at 10 feet, down at 9 feet, down at 8 feet, then that is a management that needs to be adjusted when there are communities that are being devastated by the level of water on Lake Okeechobee during the wet season because not enough water was taken off of it before that. And a case in point to this last season, the Caloosahatchee River was requesting, the municipalities around there were requesting 1,000 cubic feet per second during the dry season. They were not granted that request because they didn't want the water to get to a certain low point, and so they weren't given the authorization of that. But if they would have been given that, the lake would have been at a lower level moving into the wet season, and we'd have less need for discharge during this wet season where my community is receiving the effects of these toxic algal blooms that we had nothing to do with producing. This is the issue that's at the crux of my community, the fact that water is being held on Lake Okeechobee not just as it relates to risk management, but as it relates to the benefit of a number of other entities to the detriment of an epicenter of population. And I think this issue absolutely needs to be addressed in the short term while we're waiting for everything in this integrated delivery schedule to come to fruition. That is an emergency situation of health and welfare in an epicenter of human population. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Any questions?
Sir, thank you for tutoring me once again. I understand that problem, and I have already begun the process to look into it. I don't know how much of that retained water during the dry season is required by law yet. That's what I'm trying to find out.
Mr. Marks, could you answer that question? How much water is retained for irrigation of Lake Okeechobee is 730 square miles of roughly 450,000 acres. I believe the Everglades agricultural area is somewhere closer to 750,000 acres. I don't know what that is in square miles, but what is the amount of water that's kept on there or other consumptive use permits? Because the reality is the Corps of Engineers manages every drop of water that comes into the lake from the Kissimmee River, every bit of water that evaporates off of Lake Okeechobee, every bit of water that's discharged to the east and west coast of Florida, and every bit of water that's sent into somebody that's drinking that water out of the lake for whatever purpose. This is a game of inches. And so in that, if there's water being kept on it for other entities other than risk management, and the water's still going to be sent to them, even if the lake's down at 8 feet, as was said to me by the South Florida Water Management District, if you want to reply to that, maybe the level's lower than that, 7 feet, 6 feet, I'd love to have the answer. If that's being done, then we need to keep it at a lower level during the dry season so we're not having this issue year after year during the wet season.
So, Congressman, thank you for coming. I appreciate your questions. I can't tell you that there is a number at which we keep, but I can tell you that there are multiple entities that depend on water, at Lake Okeechobee in particular, for them to continue to exist in South Florida. There seems to be a focus on agriculture, and I can appreciate that, but I think that folks need to know a little bit more about the history and where that water goes. For instance, our STAs essentially become somewhat of a user during dry periods, being able to maintain the vegetation in those particular treatment areas so that we can treat the water appropriately and meet the stringent water quality standards going to the Everglades each year is something that we need to do, and we use water from Lake Okeechobee to do that. The Seminole Tribe of Indians relies on that water in the lake as their water supply for their reservation. The lower East Coast well fields for Miami-Dade, as well as the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, rely on the water that's in Lake Okeechobee. So I don't have an exact number for you, sir. I can tell you that there is several individuals or entities that rely on that water to the point of the agricultural users. Our water management district has authorities provided under statute to undertake restrictions at certain times, and they have implemented those restrictions in the past. So there is a cutback on some of the permitted uses, but we do focus on making sure that the tribes, the lower East Coast, get the water that they need to support the populations in those areas, as well as doing the reductions necessary during those times so that we can try and balance the needs across the spectrum.
Which is to the detriment of communities that don't need the water when it becomes the time of the wet season, what we're in right now, and we send the water to the places that don't need it, the Treasure Coast of Florida. But I would ask this question, those entities that you're talking about, would you send them water that they need for all of those things if Lake Okeechobee is at 12 feet?
Sir, I think to answer your question, if it's necessary to sustain the populations of South Florida, the people that we rely on for our economy, the people that we rely on and that enjoy the natural resources we have, that sending that water to ensure that we can maintain those populations is something that is a priority of our district and is authority given to us under law. So yes, we would send that water to the south.
Would you send the water if the lake was at 11 feet?
Sir, I think under any circumstance where you're going to ask if we go down the numbers, we're going to continue to focus the priority on human health and safety, which includes providing water for the populations that live in South Florida.
It does not include human health and safety in my community that's getting discharges of microcystin algae and cyanobacteria. But I am going to continue to ask these questions because I absolutely want it on the record. So would it happen if the lake was at 9 feet?
Sir, I think the answer is the same that I gave you before.
And 8 feet?
The same, sir.
Absolutely. So this is the point that I'm making. This water is going to go to the entities that require that water one way or another. You're managing for the ecology on a lake that is 90% covered in algal blooms, and you're worried about managing that ecology on the lake as part of that level. You're worried about keeping water levels on a lake for entities that are using that water to the detriment of a community that doesn't use that water. That's not right, that's not just, and this system needs to be adjusted during the dry season. This cannot be the way that this system works until all of these projects in the integrated delivery schedule come to completion.
Sir, I completely agree with what you're saying, which is why it's important that we've remained focused on the projects. When we talk about projects like dispersed water management, when we talk about projects about the Lake Okeechobee watershed project, all of those anticipate receiving that water, trying to store that water so that we can manage the lake in a way that's good for the people to the east, the people to the west, and the people to the south. I know it's taken some time for us to get there. We're continuing to look at those interim measures that we can take, and we're going to continue to push for those interim measures. And with the help from people like you and other representatives and our state government and our governor, we've all pushed for those things, and we're going to continue to work hard to
I appreciate your support on that. What level of advocacy would you support for the level that the lake should be in a dry season so that we don't move into a higher water level on Lake Okeechobee as we move into the wet season, the hurricane season, managing the risk of 36,000 people south of Lake Okeechobee with the potential of a failing dike? What level could you advocate for saying if they currently try to keep it at this level during the dry season, you could see it bringing it down a foot from where the goal currently is, 2 feet from where the goal currently is? What level would you like to work with me on?
Sir, I appreciate your questions. I would have to speak with my engineers and the scientists. There's ecological values at stake here. There's flood risk values at stake here. There's water supply values at stake here. I'm not equipped to answer those questions at this time.
I think we have another person who would like to comment in Seminoles.
Thank
You
you.
need to speak up.
Yep. Can you hear me now? Colonel, can I put you on the spot? I thought your presentation was great, and sort of putting some numbers to, you know, we look at this huge lake and we've got all this rain and these projects, and it's really hard to wrap your head around. And I think especially for the folks that are new to this, it seems like we should have had this done already. And once you start getting into it, it gets more and more complicated as you go. But, I mean, it's a really big lake, so why can't we just hold all the water in it as we need? And I think, and I've asked that question, I think it's a really smart question. But it might be helpful to sort of spin out a little bit about what you presented, Colonel, and you know, Ernie, not to put you on the spot now, but at some point, maybe a future presentation to the task force to talk about how much water can the lake really hold? And the lake can't hold all the rain. And we need all these other projects and all these things to fit. And I think this is a really hard question. And I can tell you, I mean, the tribe shares your feelings about everyone else is being taken care of, and you know, you get to us last. And fortunately, you know, we think that's turned, and we've gotten great cooperation from Jacksonville and the Water Management District. But it's a problem we all share. And I think as we approach the LORS study, this is the conversations that are going to be going on, and it's going to get a whole lot more heated and less polite than the conversation we're having right now, having watched that go before. So I think to the extent that that this body, as well as others, can understand really what the capacity is of what we have now, and it's just not enough. And then we can help to better understand what everyone's dealing with and trying to balance the needs and make sure that everybody's getting as much as they possibly can out of it. I mean, there's always going to be trade-offs, but no one should bear the full burden of it. And I think, you know, you could bring up any group in South Florida, and they're going to make a similar presentation to yours about, well, you're taking care of them, you know, they're louder, squeaky wheel gets the grease, what about us? And I just think we're headed into a time, and it's great news on the dike and the timing and the funding, and we're going to get into a good place soon, but it's going to be really messy getting there. So to the extent that we can all better understand the capacity of the existing system, of what's coming online, and what that's really going to look like, it's and understanding it's not going to get fixed.
Ma'am, you and I are on the exact same page. The capacity of the lake is absolutely what's in question, but my comments are not on the capacity of the lake. It's the management of the lake in the dry season, moving into the wet season. The fact that more water is kept on the lake for everybody that's drinking that water, when, as was just stated, it really doesn't matter what level the lake is at, everybody's still going to get their water. That's what was said to me at the South Florida Water Management District. That's what was just said right now, to the point of saying, listen, I don't want to answer every single level of feet that the lake is on. Everybody's going to get their water. We're an entity, a municipalities, an area that don't need the water. We're connected by man to that water, and we're saying manage the lake better when it's dry so that you don't have to send the water this way when it's wet, so that it doesn't reach what you and I agree on is a capacity that is too high, where people are placed at risk south of the lake, where we have to get a swirl of algae flowing down into our canal, where we don't have to get that. That's the management in the dry season, not at the management at the time being at capacity. And those are two completely different conversations.
Congressman, this is a very important topic, and I will freely admit that I was not familiar with this before. But what I would like to propose is that we have kind of a sub-working group to take a look at this with the folks, you included, of course, and the Corps of Engineers, to talk about the dry versus wet season capacity. And we have very, very smart people who care about this a lot. And you care about this a lot, and I don't think we can fix it today, but I do think that this conversation should continue. I think it's vitally important, really, for all people who are interested in water management, as we are, because water management affects lives, it affects businesses, it affects health. And so what I would like to propose is that we have a sub-working group along with the working group and the science coordinating working group to think about how can we frame these questions in a way that is publicly available? How can we have a conversation about this? I remember that we have the ability to have some advisory committees that are non-FACA, and I think that we should do that. So I really do appreciate the fact that you brought this to our attention, and with the tribal interests as well, I think this is a key question. So
when would you like to have the first meeting?
I'd like to have it in about 2.5 weeks. I realize I want to get people together at the table, and so today is the 25th, I believe, of what month are we? July. So I'd like to have the first meeting on or about before August the 10th.
Then we will plan for 2.5 weeks.
Great. So let's plan on doing that, and thank you so much, Congressman, for coming. And we welcome your comments, and it is a very important topic, and we look forward to continuing the work on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your time.